Hello and welcome to World Social Studies for Elementary Teachers. This is lecture F3, the last lecture in the series on non-state actors. In this lecture we look at global civil society. This lecture will examine non-governmental organizations and the role that they play in mobilizing citizens across the world. In addition, we will look at the multinational corporations and the role that they play. By the time you've listened to this lecture, you should be able to accomplish the objectives listed on this slide. On July 10th, 1985, two French Special Forces divers planted limpet mines onto the Greenpeace vessel Rainbow Warrior. The first charge blew a hole in the side of the vessel, leading to its evacuation. Several crew members returned to the ship, however, to film damage. 10 minutes after the first explosion, the second mine went off, sinking the Rainbow Warrior and killing Dutch photographer Fernando Pereira. The French were trying to prevent Greenpeace from carrying out its plan to lead a flotilla of ships to the Morora Atoll, where the French were planning a series of nuclear tests. The sinking of the Rainbow Warrior is a dramatic illustration of how the interests of states and the interests of non-state actors can, at times, be in opposition. Now, non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, are different than IGOs in their membership. If you recall, states are the members of IGOs, where with NGOs, private citizens comprise their membership. Now, that means that NGOs have a different source of legitimacy than states do. State legitimacy is dependent on the competent delivery of a country's national interest, the security, stability, and prosperity that all nations seek to achieve. NGO legitimacy, however, is dependent on its making progress on its ideological agenda, whatever that is. NGOs are reliant on the donations of their members, and so that leads to differing motives. Sometimes NGOs are pursuing an ideological motive that may or may not be in line with a national interest. Many times, though, NGOs partner with states to provide services. Since the 1980s, states have been privatizing services. Countries no longer do things they used to, and private enterprise does many things that only countries used to do. Humanitarian relief, in particular, is one of the primary areas where NGOs have taken the bulk of the burden for providing humanitarian relief. But that's also true with logistics, which in the past used to be done entirely by nation states, can now be done by independent capabilities from NGOs. So the partnership between states, IGOs, and NGOs is now well developed. In fact, if you're interested in doing humanitarian work with an NGO, the United Nations maintains the ReliefWeb website to facilitate these partnerships. And on ReliefWeb, which is just reliefweb.int, you can find information on any humanitarian crises or developmental assistance going on around the world. They have job postings for NGOs doing humanitarian work. It's a great source for maps of disaster zones and various situations that are going on. So this is all coordinated by the United Nations, which again illustrates the partnership that IGOs, NGOs, and nation states are currently engaged in. Since the Millennium Summit of 2000, the United Nations has invited NGOs to play a larger role in global conversations. They credential NGOs to go to the committee meetings and the various summits that they're having. Now, in those UN meetings, NGOs function as lobbyists. They craft language that states then place into resolutions. This has greatly increased the impact of NGOs on the global system. Now, just as factions and interest groups play a vital role in maintaining civil society in a democracy, NGOs are now playing that role in a global civil society. This makes it possible for individuals to have an impact that was simply impossible 20 years ago. You can get engaged in and involved in organizations and activities on a global scale that simply were impossible. So here, the example I have on this slide is this Anti-Corruption Club is a private organization that is putting up signs to try to stem corruption in their country. It's not a governmental program, it's a non-governmental program. Now, in addition to partnering with states, NGOs also are competitors with states. And it's important to remember that NGOs maintain their own agendas. They're not mere servants of states. When a state's interests and an NGO's ideological agenda conflict, NGOs can make powerful opponents to states. Again, this is similar to interest groups. NGOs are more effective at preventing action than they are at getting states to engage in action. They can tie states up in lawsuits. They can harass, like Greenpeace has classic harassment techniques. They can mobilize opposition to UN agencies with a negative report. They can engage in all sorts of things that create problems for states that are attempting to engage in behavior that the NGO doesn't appreciate. Like you can see the Greenpeace container that they have here. You'll notice that there's two cutouts with arms and legs and faces showing activists that are inside the container, which is designed to complicate the efforts on the part of the authorities to remove that container that they have blocked the facility that they don't appreciate here. Now, at the extreme, we might consider whether Al-Qaeda is an NGO. It fits the definition. It clearly opposes states in its pursuit of its ideological agenda. We can think of terrorists perhaps as violent NGOs. They're not state actors. They're currently operating independent of states, unlike traditional terrorist groups who tended to be sponsored by states. So the disadvantage of thinking of terrorist as a violent NGO is it's a bit of slander by association. It puts terrorists and Greenpeace and the Red Cross in the same box. It's a box that we normally reserve for do-gooders, and so it's a bit insulting to the other NGOs to have a terrorist group be in the same box as they are. But, however, one advantage to thinking of terrorists as violent NGOs is it suggests novel and perhaps more effective anti-terrorist, counter-terrorist tactics, where if you're thinking of terrorists simply as extensions of states, you might not consider some counter-terrorist tactics that might be more effective. Another non-state actor to consider are multinational corporations. These are MNCs for multinational corporations or TNCs for transnational corporations. It's useful to think of these entities as for-profit NGOs. They're non-state actors, but they are operating from a profit motive, not an ideological motive. These actors have increased in resources over the past 20 years, just as NGOs and IGOs have. In fact, in some cases, the multinational corporations have deeper pockets than the states that they're trying to do business in. They have more resources at their disposal. That raises the possibility that they could run roughshod over a poor state's national interest by manipulating the host's court system or perhaps bribing the elite. On a more positive note, the multinational corporations can mobilize capital to invest in a poor country that would be impossible for the state to do. The private sector can send much more resources than the public sector can. And they can do so without incurring public debt, which has to be repaid later on down the road. And this investment can help the host state build its infrastructure, both physical infrastructure like roads and bridges, but also develop its human infrastructure with schools and hospitals and universities. So that kind of direct investment can enhance the development of the developing world. Now, the rise of multinational corporations has led to their extended penetration into global markets. This is a key component of globalization, is these transnational or multinational corporations. So if we recall the discussion of globalization back in the C series of lectures, there are pros and cons to this increased penetration on the part of these transnational corporations. And as the slide says, that it can increase the standard of living of the citizens, but it could also threaten local producers and displace local workers. So we can think of multinational corporations as both partners and competitors to states as actors in the global arena. So this raises the issue of relative power with these actors. With globalization, the impact of non-state actors on the Westphalian system has dramatically shifted. They have an increase in both the scope and scale of operations. These corporations and other non-state actors, for that matter, are able to do things that only states could do in the past. Now, this has led some observers to question whether the Westphalian system, the state system, is in decline, or is it just changing in some way? Perhaps a new system with multiple actors will arrive, not just states. So we'll move from a system that is reliant or based on the independent sovereign state into some new system that includes the interaction of these non-state actors. For that to happen, though, NGOs and IGOs and multinational corporations, they need to have an independent military capacity. Because if you remember, the crux of what makes a state independent is its ability to have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. That private corporations and NGOs and IGOs may utilize force. For instance, this slide here is showing private contractors fighting in Iraq. But that private use of force is currently only allowed to operate within the framework that the states allow, that states give permission for private actors to use force, or they may restrict that permission, as we saw the case with those private contractors in Iraq. They no longer operate in Iraq, both because the Americans decided to end their license and stop using them, and the Iraqis passed domestic legislation prohibiting them from acting in their state. And so right now we're still in the Westphalian system where the use of force is determined by states, not the non-state actors. That's different than a private security operating with the permission of states, which we already have. As long as states maintain their monopoly on the legitimate use of force, that's how we can know that we're still in the Westphalian world. But having said that, it is clear that non-state actors, both IGOs, NGOs, and even multinational corporations, have a major impact on the system and the world that we live in. This presentation was provided courtesy of Dr. Brian Dille, the That's me. I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College.